My name is Jill Vance and I am the Director of the AFP programme in Northern Deanery. I'm also a clinical paediatric allergist at the Great North Children's Hospital here in Newcastle and Professor of Medical Education at Newcastle University. Now I know that our audience will be both current Foundation Programme trainees and students who are interested or intending to apply to the AFP programme. And in this conference, our goal was to reflect the common and important questions you all might have about navigating career pathways and how to get the most from them. We have a great lineup of speakers, trainees at different career stages who will share their experiences, perspectives and career journeys, along with faculty colleagues who manage these programmes and so have all the up-to-date information on process and practicalities. Firstly, Professor Paul Baker is Deputy Dean in the Northwest and is Academic Lead in the UK FPO Foundation School Directors Committee. He will give an overview of the Academic Foundation Programme and consider the all-important process questions on how do I apply. Next, Dr. Alex Martin is a Clinical Teaching Fellow at Newcastle University and he's just completed his AFP here. Alex will consider the questions, what does an AFP actually do? He'll share his experience, highs, possibly lows, and also how to make the most of the AFP placement, as well as keep on top of clinical progression. Dr. Matt Byrne has also completed his AFP recently and has taken up an academic clinical fellow post in Oxford Deanery. Matt will talk about his experience and how it may have influenced his decision making. This will get you thinking about why you might consider AFP. Lastly, we wanted to think about the Academic Foundation Programme in the context of wider academic career pathways. And I'm delighted that we have two speakers to present on next steps and what are the academic career pathways beyond AFP. Dr. Will Sedley is an academic clinical lecturer in neurology who was previously an AFP trainee. He will talk about his own career journey and what has made that so successful. Dr. Malcolm Broadley is an MRC clinician scientist and a clinical senior lecturer whose work focuses on paediatric respiratory medicine. He is also the director of the Northeast NIHR Integrated Academic Training Programme for doctors and dentists. Malcolm will be able to explain where AFP fits into clinical academic training pathways and what you need to do to pursue an academic career. Please do take an opportunity to ask the speakers questions. You'll have seen the Slack chat channel and please do use this. So finally, that just leaves me to thank colleagues at FDocs for this opportunity, the fantastic speakers and you, the audience, for attending, especially on a weekend. I look forward to a lively discussion throughout the morning. So first up, we are lucky to have our first speaker, who is Paul Baker, Deputy Postgraduate Dean for Health Education England. Welcome, Professor Baker. Please take it away.
My name is Paul Baker. I'm Deputy Postgraduate Dean at Health Education England, working across the northwest of England. I also have a role in academic foundation programs nationally, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about that today. Thank you for your attention. So, first slide. I'm going to split this talk into two sections. Firstly, I'll say a little bit about what academic foundation programs actually are, some background, and secondly, I'll tell you something about how to apply. What I will say repeatedly is that academic foundation and all its processes are subject to change. That happens year on year in any case. Things evolve, things improve. Even without COVID, things can change and timelines can alter. So the overarching rule here is to always check with the Foundation Programme website. Okay, that's the website that you should always use. There are two other sources of information which I want to point you towards. One is the Rough Guide to Foundation Academic Training, also to be found on that website. It gives you lots of background information and opinions from previous trainees and other sources. Very valuable information. And throughout this, I'll be reminding you that there are variations between foundation schools across the UK. That's not just across England, but across the whole of the United Kingdom. And you must check with the individual school for individual information at every point. Now, the main value of this conference here today is that you've got a very good panel to interact with. And I've highlighted three questions which often are raised with myself. I want you to consider these, and if you have a spare moment during the slideshow, please type your thoughts into the chat box. Who is this? How is he relevant? Well, you may remember this guy from a Bond movie, Tomorrow Never Dies, and his overriding advice was about careers, conveniently enough, and he said that his first boss taught him that the secret to a good story is not the what, the where, the who or the how, but it's the why. So I'm asking you, you're tuning in today, why are you interested in academic foundation careers? I want you to write your thoughts as to what really is motivating you, because that's the key to the whole process. I'm also often asked, is academic foundation the only route into academia? So give me your thoughts on that. And another consideration is, if doing academic foundation, do you have to do all the same things that other non-academic foundation trainees have to do? Give me your thoughts on those whilst I'm speaking. So what is academic foundation training? It is approximately 1/20th of the whole program. And there are about 7,500 foundation places nationally, and over 500 of those are academic foundation. So as I say, in any one school, there should be at least 1 in 20. And we generally exceed that target in the UK. Again, I will repeat, many aspects of academic foundation are school specific, so please do your local research before deciding. And academic foundation allows you to delve into the worlds of research, education, that includes education research, leadership, and there is scope for other special experience type of posts, such as quality improvement. That is not an exhaustive list. So the program allows you to develop interests and also get the support, the contacts, the networking, the information you'll need during and in addition to your first 2-year clinical training. So flexibility is built into the academic foundation program and has been right from the beginning. What must an academic foundation program deliver? Well, it has to deliver the normal foundation competencies. So the same competencies anybody else has to get in foundation training have to be delivered during academic foundation training as well. Now, AFP, as we call it, can be one of an organized step in the integrated academic training pathway, by which I mean you could be an academically minded student, you do an academic foundation training post, and then you naturally succeed into a academic clinical lecturer post and the academic pathway thereafter. It does fulfill that role. However, it can also fulfill the role of those just wanting to dip a toe into an academic career. So you may not be totally decided, you may want to see what academic work is like, and academic foundation can fulfill that as well. If you are very, very advanced as a medical student into the academic sphere, for instance, we do see applicants with PhDs or other higher degrees, maybe you don't need academic foundation. So don't think that's automatic. But once again, this is very site specific and school specific. So please do your homework. Look for different models of academic foundation because there is variability. Usually it's a 4-month block taken in FY2, but there are other models such as a half a day throughout the 2-year course. Again, do your local research. Look for the right location for you, and geography is often the overriding concern for many trainees. Look at what track models they have there, as I've just described. In particular, look for the amount of dedicated time you get from ordinary work related to academia. And this can vary from none, no added time at all, simply doing work in your spare time, to, as I've just said, 4 months off or 2 months, 4 months in the FY2 year, or half a day throughout the 2 years. So look at the time that's been allocated. Look for what input there is from your local medical school or a higher education institute. You may, for instance, get an honorary contract with them. That may give you other added values such as access to high tea, access to networks. So a lot of this is about networking and contacts for future progression. Look to see if your interests can be maintained in that post, and look at the track record of that placement, whether it be for presentations, publications, allowing you to present at conferences and so on. You may also wish to look at further postgraduate qualifications, whether you want to be a teacher, what specialty you wish to go in is important, and look at the specialty societies. And again, what access there is to their specialty conferences, publications, and so on. There are two things to consider, as well as being an academic, but also being a medical specialist. It should be part of an overall career plan, and do think about where you want to be next, where you want to be in 5 or 10 years or longer, and work backwards from that. And we've already spoken about specialty or GP training. There is an integrated academic training pathway, but I would warn you that this is specific to the 4 countries in the United Kingdom. So although England is 85% of the population, and you've heard of NIHR, the academic institution, that is England only. And if you are in Northern Ireland, Wales or Scotland, there are separate systems for that. And the reference I would give you for that is, once again, the Rough Guide to Academic Foundation Training, to be found on the UKFPO Foundation website. So the second section of the presentation is about applying for academic foundation in the United Kingdom. And again, the health warning is there that things are subject to change. They're subject to change even more in an era of COVID. And you must always check with 3 sources of information before making final decisions. The main source is the UKFPO website. That's the UK Foundation Programme Office. Website is there on the slide. There's a rough guide to academic foundation, which is to be found on that website, which has a lot of useful information. And be sure to look at the information for each specific school, because we know that it can vary. Once again, the main value of this conference is that you can interact with the panel. So once again, I'm asking you to put in 3 questions about the application to AFP into the chat box, and I'll address those whilst we're talking. There will be opportunity for further questions at the end. So why is this guy relevant? He's not a Bond villain. Some of you may know that it's Steve Jobs, and he was the founder of the Apple phenomenon that we all know. And he can be a divisive figure to some, but he certainly achieved a lot of things. And what did he say? He said, I'm paraphrasing here, but he gave a very, by now famous valedictory speech at an American educational institution. And to paraphrase, he said, find the job you love and do that. Those weren't his exact words. I think there's another saying such that goes something like, if you find the job you love, you'll never work a day in your life. So this is all about career choices and making something that you're interested in really count for that. 3 questions then. If I do academic foundation, will I get less clinical experience? Commonly asked. Is there a master's qualification? What is the scope for that? And what are units of application? That's a vital piece of understanding if you're going to apply for academic foundation. So, the appointment system is known as Oriel. That's the IT platform for the foundation applications. All the information is on the website, and to be looking for AFP placements, firstly, it sounds obvious, you must have the correct provisional GMC registration, as does any newly qualified doctor in the UK, and apply for the foundation program first, and then you consider the foundation options. So register on Oriel. There are what we call 2 units of application, and you'll need to know which ones you're applying to. You can apply to only 2, and for all the programs in those 2 units of application, those geographical groupings, you may be asked to rank all the programs in AFP that are available. So be prepared to do that and to stop your ranking at a point where you're no longer maybe interested in those placements, and we can discuss that later. Again, very school specific. There are almost as many variations of the application process as there are schools, but you will all have to go through the first 2 steps that I've just mentioned there. That is, get registered, apply for UK academic foundation training. This is the timeline, and it's correct at the time of speaking. Hopefully it won't have to change because of any pandemic or other considerations, but that is the timeline. So very soon, Oriel will open. The dates are there, and there is a window during which you can apply. And the academic recruitment can be in stages, again, depending on the school and how large the school is, how sought after the school is. There will be different competition ratios, and you will all have to go through some sort of long roll shortlisting and interviews. So that's the preference for nearly all academic schools. They are likely to want an interview, which in 2021 will be more than likely online. Again, do your homework, do your local research. You will all have to do the situational judgment test, which is the route into foundation training in the UK. Again, it's a digital platform run by an organisation called Pearson VUE. You are able to book a slot in a date, a time and locations throughout the UK. That will be on a first come, first served basis. So please don't leave everything to the last minute, or you may not be able to get the slot you want. And applications generally, please don't leave till the last minute. On the last day of applications at noon, that's the time the applications close, we're very often looking in the last hour to see people still not finishing their applications, and that's very risky. IT can fail, things can go wrong, so please don't leave it till the last minute. I'm often asked, can you withdraw from applications? Well, you can, but withdrawing before an offer is very much more easy than withdrawing after an offer. So please look at the website, look at the guidance for Academic Foundation, and make sure you're aware of the rules before doing that. By and large, the rule is if you apply before an offer has been accepted, you will go forward to the normal foundation application process. Afterwards is much more difficult, and we don't suggest that you do that. So again, please check the website. And offers we start to be given in the middle of January, and it should all be done and dusted by the 11th of February. So that's the end of the brief section on applying for the Academic Foundation Programme. I've left it fairly light on technical details because there are lots of variations locally and lots of technicalities which you may be asking about of the national part of the process. It's impossible for me to know every single if, then, else type of question you may ask.
Thank you so much, Paul. I know that will be invaluable to many of our attendees.
Hi everyone, I'm Pedro Rabi'i and I'm the HR Live lead. So, what is HR Live? I don't think even I know. HR Live is a weekly webinar series that holds conversations with interesting people across healthcare and a wider society. Thank you, Google. But seriously, HR Live is this amazing. It's not gonna work.
Hello and welcome to HLA Live. This is the 6th episode of HLA Live.
Good evening, everyone. I am really excited to be chairing tonight's meeting.
Hello, I'm Alistair. I'm a final year Newcastle medical student and a scholar of the HLA. I'm very interested in surgery and I will be one of your hosts this evening.
Hi, I'm Rosie Spooner and I'm hosting HLA Live this Wednesday.
And I'm an HLA scholar and I'm also going to be your host this evening.
Hi, my name is Jess and I recently graduated as a doctor.
We'll start while everyone else ponders because that way they can give better answers than me.
My heart is full of joy this evening, really. And I have my granddaughter with me and my daughter. I haven't seen them since February.
Oh gosh.
So I will be telling them about this event. My granddaughter.
Quite quick, we have ideas, let's do this, let's do that. So we said let's launch Straight Direct, and within 3 months we thought we would be on the market, so that was a bit crazy. But actually we did a pre-launch within a few months, just to kind of, with a simple quiz capture, just to kind of gather some data.
It's a big question and I'm a bit worried that you've got like 3 minutes before we're going to start this. Cool. We're clear. Well done, everyone. That was really cool. That was really powerful. There were so many really good points made.
Our next speaker is a former AFP trainee, Dr. Alex Martin. Alex is going to talk us through a day in the life of an AFP. Over to you, Alex.
Hi, I'm Alex, a former Academic Foundation Programme trainee in the Northern Deanery and now a Clinical Teaching Fellow at Newcastle University. I'm going to be talking about a day in the life of an Academic Foundation trainee. I'm going to be talking about my experience as an AFP and go through a typical week during my academic post. The original title of the talk was A Day in the Life, but actually I think a better title would be A Week in the Life, because one of the key takeaways for me was the variety of what I got up to, and one day just wouldn't do it justice. So I'm going to talk about a week in the life instead. I'll also talk about the benefits and challenges of AFP and how to make the most out of the post. So my foundation posts look like this. I started out with academic medicine with Medicine on Calls, and I'll talk a little bit more about the experience of starting on an academic job. I then went on to a busy job in gastroenterology and then acute medicine, then an even busier job in hepatobiliary surgery. My F2 year started with paediatrics, which was split into general and specialty paediatrics, and then I was due to have more surgery, but I found a swap to medicine, which is something that your deanery of choice may or may not permit. In Northern Deanery, we've got 2 academic blocks, and I was supposed to do academic medicine in my last post, but due to coronavirus I was redeployed, so I stayed on in acute medicine and did a total of 6 months there. So my F1 academic post was characterised by a lot of variety. So firstly I was involved in a large multinational study called PERFORM, which was looking at personalised biomarkers for sepsis. I also explored my own research question looking at clinical features of bacterial infection in immunocompromised children, and that was done at the Great North Children's Hospital. That used data from the larger study, but it was my own study which I had control of. I also had a chance to try new things, so I learned to use high-level PPE, and for someone who is more comfortable with clinical research, I even did some lab work. I also got involved in some patient-public involvement for our study, which is something that's increasingly expected in grant applications and was a really useful experience that I've taken into my own work. So what did a week look like for me during the F1 academic post? Well, on Monday I might have been working on the PERFORM study, consenting and recruiting patients, collecting blood samples, centrifuging them, freezing them for later analysis. One of the things that I hadn't really appreciated was when you're working on a really large study, just how many samples you end up with, and managing those, tracking them, not losing them, was a really big task in doing this study. After that, I might have worked on some electronic case report forms that collect patient data and addressed any queries from the data management team. The next day I might have worked on my audit and prepared some medical student teaching. I also spent time working on my own independent research question, which used data from PERFORM. We also had study team meetings, more recruitment. I would go to F1 teaching during lunchtime, and then maybe I'd have some lab work for the study, and I'd deliver that teaching that I prepared earlier in the week. 1 in 4 weekends I would have the Friday off and then work long days back of house in adult medicine. And 1 in 4 weeks I would also work the evenings Monday to Thursday in medicine. So these on-calls kept me up to date with my clinical skills, but they also kept my hours up, so I was working 48 hours, which was on par with the rest of my colleagues, so I was actually bringing in the same amount of money as a lot of them were. So due to COVID, I was redeployed from my academic post and I carried on in acute medicine. And this was actually quite nice because many of the other jobs that I've been working in have been quite short, and for the first time I really felt part of the team. Especially COVID brought together the acute medicine team, and the consultants were really thankful for us being there. However, even during redeployment, there were opportunities to get involved in other things, and that was all made easier by the skills that you develop as an AFP. Because I had experience in clinical research studies and good clinical practice training and advanced life support, I was able to be released from clinical work to work as a co-investigator on the Chaddox NIHR COVID vaccine trial. So I recruited and consented patients and got them ready to have the new investigational vaccination for COVID. I also got involved in the running of simulation teaching for our new incoming F1s. Also, your F2 post is generally when things you've worked on start to come together, and between my F1 and F2 posts I managed to have a poster presented at an international meeting. I got some education work presented locally, completed 2 cycles of an audit, published a case report, and there's 2 more research manuscripts in progress from all of that as well. So even missing one of the academic jobs, I was still able to get a lot of good outputs from my CV. The AFP does come with some challenges, and those are really important to recognise and reflect before you apply and during your post. I had my academic job first, which was a little daunting as I've had no experience doing a ward job, but had on calls, weekends and evenings, and arguably during those you've got a bit less support. Somebody with limited experience, even doing basic procedures like cannulation, and less confidence overall, you're kind of getting thrown in the deep end a little bit doing that. Academic work can also be a little bit different to clinical work. So when I was doing my hepatobiliary surgery job as an F1, I was personally looking after about 25 quite sick patients across several wards with quite limited support, and would often get maybe 50 calls a day chasing up tasks, sometimes multiple calls about the same thing, and I was often juggling several things at once. So while that was challenging in its own way, equally on my academic post, I was often left to decide what I should be doing for long periods, and it can be quite hard to know what to do next, and some people might find it difficult to motivate themselves in those circumstances. AFPs generally have less clinical time than everyone else as well. Depending on the region, you might have 4 or even 8 fewer months in full-time clinical practice, which is the case in Northern Deanery, and so you'll need to work that bit harder to feel as confident as the rest of your peers. There's also fewer opportunities to engage with your portfolio during your academic post, and so overall you need to complete your portfolio in less time. This really creeps up quickly because you have to submit your completed portfolio early on in the last job of the year, meaning that you have to work hard in your clinical posts to keep up. My second post was a busy general and acute medicine post, which did get me back up to speed clinically quite quickly. However, a lot of the data that I needed to work on my own research question wasn't ready until after I'd finished that first academic post. This meant that to progress my work, I had to do some work during another post, which fell during the medicine post. But it can be difficult to find time to do this. So this is an example of my acute medicine rota. So it was all 12.5-hour shifts, 50% nights, and 1 and 2 weekends. So you were equally spending time between doing nights, recovering from nights, doing long days, or you had a small amount of time off. For anyone who's done research alongside being a student, it's not quite the same doing it alongside a full-time job. You're learning a lot of new things, the job can at times be stressful, the hours are long, you're working 48 hours a week, so when you come home you don't necessarily want to work on research, so you really need to be careful to look after yourself. Your AFP might give you really exciting opportunities to do independent research, contribute to larger projects, and also get opportunities to teach, get involved in quality improvement, and just develop yourself generally outside of clinical work. And you should absolutely pick things that interest you and try them. But part of making the most out of the post is, and that is both the academic component of the post and the clinical component, is that you will be plenty busy on your clinical jobs, and you need to look after yourself and take the time to explore what it's like working in a different way, working in the way that academics do. You need to think about when to say no to things. Often the type of people who do AFP say yes to lots of different opportunities, but you can't say yes to everything and still do a good job of everything. This can be a bit of a balancing act between what you promise and what you deliver, and it's important to manage expectations. I think it's a really important part of your self-growth as an academic clinician to recognise what you're able to achieve, how much time you have, and what you're able to deliver. Amongst all of the opportunities that you've got available to you, remember that you are a doctor first above everything else. You need to keep on top of your clinical and portfolio commitments, and this will reduce your stress in the long run. Don't worry too much about your clinical competence overall. Part of the selection for AFP is for people who the selectors think will be able to juggle these different commitments, and you will be as competent as your peers after a couple of jobs. Remember your portfolio and start working on it quite early. It's absolutely essential to make sure that you take the portfolio seriously and work on it from the beginning. Try and find any opportunities that come up to try and work towards it, and that will help you avoid stress at the end of the year. So what are my takeaways from all this? So AFP is great. I can't speak for other deaneries, but my AFP program in Northern Deanery and with my supervisor, there was the flexibility to get involved in lots of things within and also not directly linked to your research. It allows you to pursue something that interests you and to develop new skills. Academic work's quite different to working on the ward. That can be a relief, but it can also be quite challenging in its own way. Remember that despite all the opportunities that will be available to you, you need to manage expectations and know when to say no to things. Respect your portfolio as well, because it can cause you a lot of stress if you don't. Above all everything else, you're a doctor first, and the priority for your foundation program is to develop the skills you'll use as a doctor for the rest of your career. Finally, I'd say that if my experience sounds good to you, the level of variety and the chance to explore something that really interests you in much more detail, then I'd say go for it, and I'm pretty sure you're going to really enjoy it.
Thank you, Alex. Next, I'd like to hand things over to Dr. Matt Byrne. Matt is a current ACF in Oxford and a former AFP in Cambridge. Matt will give his perspective on whether or not you should consider AFP in the first place. Over to you, Matt.
Hi, thanks for having me here. Prof Vance has asked me to speak about my experience of the AFP, so I know why I'm here. But I'd want to start off with a quick question to you. Why are you here? I think the simple answer is to learn more about the AFP, so I want you to think deeper. Why are you here when you could be doing something else on your weekends? Take 30 seconds to think about that question. Write it down in the chat if you want, or if you don't want to share, then on a piece of paper will be fine, and we'll revisit it later. So while you're thinking about that, I'll let you know a little bit about me. So I did my medical training in Newcastle. I had my first exposure to academia when I did an audit in 4th year, and I liked the feeling as though I was making a difference rather than just following the rules or rote learning things. I then did an MRes in transplantation as I liked immunology and surgery, and I put all my eggs into one basket and went hard on transplant. I did an AFP in Cambridge in transplantation and thought perhaps it wasn't for me. So I took a year out to make up my mind, and when I did that I also did a PG cert. I ended up doing an ACF in urology as I decided I wanted to sleep when I was a consultant. So back to our question, why are you here? You might already be interested in research, you might be on the fence, perhaps you've done a little bit of research and you want to hear more, and maybe it'd be something nice for your CV. And I think broadly speaking, these are the main reasons that people apply to the ACF. Or AFP. So what's my role going to be here today? I'm going to talk to you about why you should consider the AFP, how you could get the most out of your AFP, career progression afterwards, and if you have any questions as we go along, please drop them in the chat. So first things first, we'll look at why you should consider the AFP. We'll discuss what the point of an AFP is, what it offers you, alternatives to normal applications, and academic projects. So first of all, what's the point of an AFP? It's an introduction to the integrated academic pathway. The aim from a purely institutional point of view is to generate clinicians who are trained in research and have time to perform research. But what does it offer you? The main benefits are exposure to research, dedicated academic time, either day release, a 4-month block or variations around that. And this allows you to develop your research skills and also transferable skills. Gives you an opportunity to network with a team you might not have exposure to normally. And a small number of deaneries offer extra things like academic teaching courses and training, PG certs and research bursaries. And all of these things make it easier to progress along that academic training pathway. It's also an alternative to the normal job application, as well as those reasons I discussed before. When I was at med school, I was good at taking exams, but I excelled in extracurriculars and interviews. The AFP gave me an opportunity to get a job by playing to my strengths rather than worrying about doing well in the SJT. AFPs also tend to be linked to teaching hospitals, so it's an alternative route to get the plum jobs too. For example, I knew I wanted to do surgery, and out of my 6 foundation rotations, 3 were surgical and 1 was research. It also gives you 2 bites of the cherry at competitive job applications such as London, Admittedly, the AFPs do have a 5-to-1 competition ratio on average, so it'll be more competitive in those locations too. But the main attraction of the AFP is the academic project. Some are themed AFPs, and they might have specific speciality themes, or they might go beyond medical research, for example, leadership and med ed. Overall, there's a large amount of autonomy. Some AFPs are very flexible, but admittedly some are quite inflexible too. And this might help inform where you want to apply. I did my AFP in Cambridge, and I had ultimate flexibility. I could choose exactly what I wanted to do, and it didn't have to be related to the transplant theme at all. I know some people who did ophthalmology research on my transplant themed AFP. But for some people that might be a downside, as there was zero structure and we had to organise everything. I think the London AFPs might be slightly less flexible, but I might be wrong. And even if you don't get your AFP, it's still good interview practice for your core training interviews. So how to get the most out of your AFP. In this section, we'll talk about setting a goal, finding a supervisor in a project, thinking beyond the project, outputs, how you can use role models to help inform what you want to do, the role of networking, taster weeks, extracurricular activities, and then some of the negatives about doing an AFP. So first of all, how to make the most of it. If we go back to your reason for why you're here today, you can probably use that to set yourself a broad goal for your AFP. So for example, if you're already interested in research, you can use your project to go in something in more depth. If you've not done that much research before and you're not sure about it, you can use it as a time to figure out whether you like it or not. And you can use it as a chance to do things that will prepare you for core training as well. So the first step is to set yourself a goal. I think the primary aim should be to figure out whether you actually like research or not. And if you do, what sort of research do you like? You can use it as a time to help you figure out what specialty you want to do. And you can then use this to help you start thinking about your life plan. I wouldn't focus too much on outputs during this time, but we'll discuss that in more detail later. So the first step is to find a supervisor. And my tips for this would be to plan early. So really, you should be thinking about this before you even apply for your AFP. For example, I knew I wanted to work with Professor Nicholson at Cambridge, who is an expert in ex vivo organ perfusion. So I sent him a message before I'd applied for the AFP to see what sort of projects I could be involved in. And I spoke to other people there too to figure out whether it would be a good option. So once you're in your AFP, you should then seriously start organising it, organising your F2 research block when you're in F1. Because particularly if you're organising things like ethics or patient recruitment, it can take longer than 4 months. So you might end up spending your entire research block organising things without actually doing any research. My next tip would be to talk to multiple supervisors, explore things you can do, what your role in their team would be, and also look at their publishing record. Are they publishing? Who are they working with? And speak to their students too. What do they think of the team, and is it a nice environment to work in? Once you've heard from the supervisors, you'll get a broad idea of what sort of projects you can do. Alternatively, if you know what project you want to do, you can do it the other way around by focusing more on the project and then trying to align that with potential supervisors. And depending on the flexibility of your AFP, you can do pretty much any project, but people tend to do preclinical work, such as lab projects, but also some data science. You might also do clinical work, so patient recruitment, clinical database analysis, involved in audit, but more commonly, there are also these leadership and management AFPs and also education AFPs. So there's scope to do anything really. So how do you figure out what sort of project to choose? This can sometimes be quite difficult. And what you can do to help yourself is to think about what you enjoy and what you dislike. That's obviously obvious, but think about why. Try and be as specific as possible. Patterns then emerge and you can use these to inform and refine your choices. You can do the same for what specialty you want to do as well. For example, can you bear doing cell culture? If not, then you probably want to avoid cellular biology. And you also need to think about what's achievable. 4 months is quite a long time, but it's also quite a short time in terms of research. Particularly if you've got a day release program, you might struggle to do a lab project. Next thing is to try not to take too much on board, and don't be afraid to say no. And this is something that I still struggle with, so it's really a skill that you should be trying to perfect as you go along. And make sure you finish any project that you do start with them. Finally, have a backup plan. What happens if you can't do your main project? So for example, one of my ideas would be to do some data analysis on my AFP, but unfortunately we couldn't get access to the data in time, even though I'd organised it in my F1 block. We still couldn't get access to the data, so I had to have a backup plan for that. So I ended up doing a systematic review as well. And I'd encourage you to think beyond your project. So 4 months is a long time. You won't have to do any on-calls, and you'll have so much time to do things. You'll have time to go and see that weird operation or clinic you wanted to watch. You can do teaching or be the chair of some society, maybe have a side hustle or a hobby that you'd want to spend more time doing. I think the strength of the AFP is not necessarily the project you do, but the time you have to explore whatever you want. And you might end up doing a research project that's not particularly successful, but because you had the time to spend doing the things you enjoyed and the things you were interested outside of the project, you got much more out of your AFP. And with that in mind, I'd encourage you to be opportunistic. Know your ABCD. Always be collecting data. And think, can I get an output out of this? And not just publications, but say you're doing a teaching session. Think about the feedback you can get. Collecting that data might be something that you can put in your portfolio later. And while it's good to be ambitious, it can be difficult to achieve anything in 4 months. It's unlikely that you'll get a Nature paper out of this, although one of my friends did. I'm not salty at all about that. And I found this study very interesting. They asked 56 AFPs what their outcomes were from their time during their AFP. 60% wrote up a study for publication. 70% presented their results in a meeting. And if I'm honest, I think those percentages are quite low. I think everyone should be able to present at a local meeting, even if you don't finish your project. You can still present your preliminary data or give people an update on what you're doing. I did all of these outcomes except 3 of the educational ones, which was sort of focusing around curriculum design. And I think you can get a lot done. And these are sort of an idea of what sorts of things you might have as an output. But as I said before, I don't think the main aim of the AFP should be outcomes. I think it should be to figure out whether you like research or not. But if you do want outcomes, aim to get the most out of everything you do before you even start doing it. One of my friends would refer to the holy trinity of outcomes: a poster, an oral presentation, and a publication. And if this is your aim for every project, well, you might not get all 3 for everything you do. You'll end up with a lot of stuff on your CV. You also don't need to just aim for the best journal and international presentations. These are very difficult, particularly at your stage. Instead, think about easier options, like local presentations, non-PubMed indexed journals or student journals, and conference abstracts too. These might seem pointless because they don't count towards FPAS, but they pad out your white space questions. They show a strong research ethic. And also some ST3 applications want second authorships, some want non-PubMed indexed publications. So although they might not seem the most useful at this point, they are in fact very useful longer term. And you can list anything on your CV, so why not? With this in mind, I'd encourage you to pick the low-hanging fruit. Often the projects that students and AFPs get during medical school or their AFP block aren't the most amazing, because remember, you're still learning how to do research. And because of this, it can mean it's harder to publish or present some of these things. And unless you're publishing, trying to publish a case report on your grandma's pneumonia, you'll be able to publish almost anything if you try hard enough. This is one of my favourite articles. It focuses on, it's an educational article, but you can apply the same strategies for your own research. It has a great table in it that shows you all the places that you can publish things. But it's not all about publishing. It's also about making your life easier for yourself. So as well as seeking out those easy publication types, like, for example, writing a full research paper is very difficult. If you've not done much writing before, you can seek out case reports, letters, editorials, reviews, collaborative authorships. These are much quicker to write. It takes months to take a research project from start to submitted. It took me 1 day to write a case report that I published. And you'll never write that Nature paper when it finally comes if you can't write something simple. But like I say, it's not all about publications. You can make your life easier by finding a mentor. And that's not just your academic senior supervisor, but someone who can actually teach you research skills, so a PhD or a postdoc. You can also collaborate with others on your research. For example, you could run an experiment for someone else. In return, they'd help you run some of your experiments. Or you could write up the introduction for someone's project, and in return they could do the same, and then you're getting your name on multiple publications, essentially by doing the same amount of work. One of my friends used an analogy to describe research outputs, which I thought was quite good. He described that you have a kicking game and a defensive game. Your kicking game are your major successes, the international oral presentations, major prizes, publications in high-impact journals. But if you only focus on kicking, you're probably going to lose the game because that only forms a minor part of it. Instead, you also need to focus on slowly gaining ground consistently over time. These are your local presentations, your case reports, and some of the smaller outputs. If you have a good defensive game, you might only need one kick to win the match. But it's not easy to know what to do, what prizes or grants are available, what positions you could apply for. And one way you can do that, or you can figure out what's available, is by looking at what other people are doing. People generally like to show off what they want, or show off their achievements, particularly on LinkedIn. So if you search for AFP at whichever deanery, ACF at whatever other deanery, you can have a look at what they've done. And this will give you an idea of what you can do, both in terms of research projects, but also extracurriculars, prizes, societies you can apply for, and things like that. So let's have a look at an example. This is Sarah, who kindly agreed for me to share her bio with you. Let's have a look at what she's done. So in addition to her AFP and her ACF, she's also done an intercalated bachelor's degree, a master's of public health, and she's involved in global surgery and international groups. She's done some teaching and has developed some educational resources. I love looking at what other people have done. For example, with Sarah, I didn't realise that there was a WFNS, a World Federation of Neurosurgical Societies. And you can use this role modelling to see what opportunities there are for you. For example, maybe you're interested in dermatology. Perhaps you want to set up a World Federation of Dermatology Societies. I will caveat this point though. When you're looking at people's bios, don't be too hard on yourself. Remember that you don't have to work all the time, and that someone will probably always be better than you. As depressing as that sounds, it will make it a lot easier when you're looking at these things, because there are some very impressive people out there. You'll never get something by not applying. And what do you have to lose? Only time and a bruised ego. But we can avoid the second by embracing failure as a learning experience. I've applied to so many things and been rejected. Papers, grants, positions, and the first few times it really hurts. But after that it becomes much easier. Still stings a bit, but it's never as bad as the first time. When you do get rejected, always ask for feedback and reflect on it. You can learn so much each time, and it can help you identify gaps in your CV too. And most of the time, these things don't really matter. There are so many journals you can apply for, so many grants and so many prizes. So you're bound to get a few if you apply to enough of them. And by learning from the things that don't matter, it increases your chances of getting the things that do matter. And success breeds success. I'm pretty sure this is my dad's favourite phrase, and apparently it's been scientifically proven. Me being here right now is an example of that. And in this study, they showed that you only need a small amount of success early on for it to generate a big difference. So by attending this talk today, by learning how you can do these things, hopefully, an early case report, learning those skills might be all that's required to succeed. But it is a balance. Avoiding the first problem that we described, in that applying to a lot of things can waste time, is difficult. But it can be achieved by limiting the amount of time you spend applying to these things. For example, when I was at medical school, I entered a lot of essay competitions. Why? 2 reasons. My primary aim was to improve my writing style and my speed. And obviously the secondary aim was to potentially win a prize, and that was an added benefit. But as the likelihood of winning the prize is quite low, I'd limit the amount of time I spent on each of the essays I was writing. So I'd only spend 1.5 days maximum on each essay. And that way, if I didn't win, it didn't really matter, as I hadn't wasted a whole week writing something. The other thing you can think about is recycling your waste. So if you make an application to something, save it. That way, the next time you apply, you can use it again, hopefully all of it, but definitely parts of it. And for essays, if they're rejected, try and use it for something else. Maybe submit it to a student journal. I didn't understand how important networking was when I started in academia, and when I was at medical school, but it is very important. I'd recommend all the foundation year doctors to get Twitter. It's a really useful resource. It allows you to network with literally anyone. You can send anyone a message. They may or may not reply. More often than not, though, they do. And that means that you've got essentially access to the entire world's experts. You can ask anyone any question. For medical students, maybe you want to consider joining Twitter, maybe not. I think it can induce a little bit of anxiety. I wasn't on Twitter as a medical student, and I'm quite glad I wasn't, in a way, because I think I would have got anxious about it, because you can be overexposed to all these opportunities, and you can feel as though you need to work all the time. You don't. You can relax. You need to work hard, but you don't need to work the entire time. Networking, though, allows you to find out the insider information that's not often published. So if you're not on Twitter, it would be worthwhile speaking to people about where you want to go. So, for example, speaking to the current AFPs, if you're a final year medical student, speaking to them can help you find out the insider information about the AFP project, or AFP in that deanery that you want to apply to. If you're a current foundation trainee, I'd encourage you to do a taster week as well during your AFP block, simply because it can be very difficult to know what specialty you want to do. Even if you're sure, it can allow you to maybe see a really niche part of that specialty. For example, not many centres offer andrology, urology research. That's pretty niche. So if you were interested in that, if you're interested in urology like me, maybe you'd want to do that. And there's this article, I'd really recommend it. I hear it's quite good. And that can sort of walk you through all the things you'd need to do a taster week. I'd also encourage you to do something fun. Spending your entire time at med school or foundation training focusing solely on research means your CV will probably be quite a boring read, and you will be probably pretty bored. And unless you've got an amazing project, it probably won't stand out. So have a think about what your unique selling point is. Maybe you run a sport, or maybe you do a sport, or you run a society, something like that. I'd aim to be as rounded as possible for your own sanity, if nothing else. So what are the downsides to doing an AFP? Well, research is difficult. It's frustrating when your experiment fails and you have to repeat it, especially if it's the 4th or 5th time it happens. It can take a huge amount of time to do research, not just the project, but the write-up, preparing posters, things like that. And most of the work is done outside of working hours, so you don't get paid. And it's time that you could be doing a locum too. You need to hit deadlines. So last week I stayed up until midnight one day because I needed to make changes to a paper so we could submit the results to a conference by the deadline. And you'll need to make sacrifices. So I wrote this presentation on a night shift last week when I could have been sleeping, or I could have been watching a film or something like that. And it's also lonely as well. Simply starting a new job in a new city on an academic block means you won't have as much exposure to everyone who's doing the normal foundation program. And running experiments in the lab, sometimes they'll be running at weird hours. Often you'll just be doing the experiments alone. So it can be a little bit lonely. These two studies by Bogad and Borelli looked at some of the other problems that students encountered. So there was a lack of structure. Like I say, you've really got to drive your own project most of the time. Someone won't really be looking at what you're doing. They won't be chasing you. You have to be driving it. There's also variable experiences between trainees. So some will have a really good time. Some might have and get loads of stuff out of it. Some might have a really difficult time. And that, I think, is the benefit of speaking to people who've done it before. They'll be able to give you that insider info about what worked, what didn't work, and why. 4 months is quite a long time, but it's also quite a short time in terms of research. So if you think about someone doing a PhD, that's 3 years long, and they're going to get an output out of that. And even then, some people struggle to get outputs out of that. So 4 months isn't very long, but equally, it can be a very long time. You can get a lot of stuff out of it. You also have to apply while you're at medical school, and it might conflict with exams you have or maybe learning. And your AFP comes out after your foundation offer. So it comes out before your foundation offer. So it might be hard if you don't get your top choice AFP, because you might be thinking, well, I've got an AFP in one city, but I don't really want to be there. Should I wait until I get my foundation offer and see if I get it in my top choice? On the other hand, if you get the right location, but you don't get your first choice AFP, and you're in a place that has an inflexible AFP program, you might end up doing a project in a specialty you don't want to. So that's difficult too. AFP blocks are also unbanded, so you make less money. In theory, you can do loads of locums, and you can actually make more money on your AFP by doing night shifts at the weekend or on calls at the weekend. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. It's also not always fun. Sometimes it's type 1 fun, but mostly it's type 2 fun. Something that commonly comes up is, are you missing out on your clinical training? I would say no, you are not. In my opinion, foundation training largely misses the training part. You only miss 4 months, and most likely those 4 months will be will be you being a scribe on medical ward rounds. You won't struggle to fill your competencies. I did half of mine in a week. It's really not difficult. So if you have a modicum of organisational skills, you'll be absolutely fine. Jill asked me to share some of my interesting AFP outputs. As I said earlier, the foundation program is a great time to explore other things you're interested in. So although I did get I did work on a couple of projects, to be honest, they weren't that interesting. I feel as though my interesting outputs were the things I did outside of my AFP block. I started a society at university called We Are Donors, and during my AFP we grew it into a charity. So we give talks to schools about organ donation, and over the 2 years of my AFP block we built a community consisting of 9 groups in the UK, and we spoke to over 3,500 students. And by exploring this interest, first of all, I enjoyed it a lot, but also we won loads of prizes from universities, international and national conferences, and we were awarded grants for our work. And if anyone's interested in, maybe you don't have a leadership position, if anyone's interested in setting up a group at their university, please send me an email. And how did I come up with this idea to turn my society into a charity? Well, I saw an AFP had set up a charity on their LinkedIn page when I was looking at that in final year, and I thought I could do that. I also started a journal, again by expanding on some of the work I'd done as a medical student. I worked with the National Student Association of Medical Research to found a journal, and I was editor-in-chief of the first 2 issues. And I'd encourage everyone to submit something to that, and the link's there if you need it. So essentially the world is your oyster. You can do anything during your AFP. So thinking beyond the AFP, I won't spend too long on this, as I know Will be talking about this in more depth. However, it's worthwhile having a short-term plan and a long-term plan. So what will I be doing in the next year or 2, and what will I be doing in the next 5 years? So if you're an AFP currently, one way you can help yourself and help plan is by thinking about the ACF and ST3 criteria. If you don't end up applying for an ACF, you'll still have ticked all of the boxes for the ST3 criteria by looking at it. So it's worthwhile. And here are some resources. I'll touch on these in a little bit, sorry. So I didn't apply for the ACF or core training in my F2 because I knew I wanted to do research, but as I said before, I wasn't really sure which to choose, whether transplant or urology. And with the ACF, you're locked into it. So it's a 10-year program, the ACF. So I took a year out as an anatomy demonstrator. I did a bit more urology and found that was a good fit, but I still wasn't really 100% sure. So I applied for the Cambridge ACF in transplant and the Oxford ACF in urology. And in the end, I was fortunate enough to get both. So that scuppered my plan to make my decision a little easier. But I think it shows that if you do your academic preparation well, it doesn't matter so much if you change your mind about what specialty you want to do later. I think it does help knowing what you want to do early on because you can put all your eggs in one basket. But if you change your mind later, that can make it slightly more challenging, but it's not impossible. I did it, and I know people who did ENT, all ENT, and then they changed their mind and now they're a general surgical ACF. So it doesn't matter if you change your mind. But beyond AFP, I think you have to be genuinely interested in research. And I don't think it's worthwhile applying if you're just doing it for your CV. It's far too much work. And you're taking away someone else's place and you won't get the most out of it. So I wouldn't recommend that. And you don't need loads of publications. I think I had 3 when I applied for ACF, but you do need a unique selling point. So I think it'd be worthwhile working on that. So for further reading, for medical students, these are 2 articles I'd recommend. They summarise the positives and negatives well, and how to apply as well. They also publish the white space questions in advance now, which they didn't when I applied. We only had a week to write ours. And I think even if you're not in the position to apply, so you're in non-final year and you're watching this talk, I think it might be worthwhile having a look at those anyway, because it might help you see if there are any gaps in your CV that you might want to fill in the time you have left. And And for foundation doctors who are interested in applying to the ACF, they publish the interview shortlisting criteria. So it's worthwhile having a look at those in advance, and you can see those in Appendix 5 of that article, or that report. So you just essentially need to try and work through that and tick every box on there. Some of them are quite difficult, so you might not get them. I didn't have all of them, and I still got my ACF. But it's worthwhile having a look at those, and then also the core and specialty training portfolio schemes as well to help you plan what you might want to do. So in summary, we've talked about what the AFP can offer you, strategies for making the most of your AFP, and you can also apply these more generally to research at any time. And we've also talked briefly about how to start making a plan for the future, and how that can help you in your future too. So I want you to reflect on the following questions. Why do you want to do research, and be specific about that? What specialty, project or supervisor might you want to pursue, and again be specific. Are there any missing outputs from what you're already doing, and can you squeeze the pips from anything you've done anymore? What's your unique selling point? What extracurricular activities are you doing? And taking all of this into account, what's your plan for the next 2 years? I started getting interested in research in my 4th year of my medical degree, and I sort of seriously considered the AFP about 18 months before applying. And before then, I didn't really have anything on my CV. So you can do quite a lot in that amount of time. And if you've left it until the last minute, again, I wouldn't worry. You can often piece together all the things you've done into something that tells quite a nice story anyway. So thank you very much for listening. I'm happy to answer any questions if you just post them in the chat. And these are some opportunities you might be interested in. As I discussed previously, we're looking to set up new university groups, and you can send me an email on that email address if you have some things that you think might be suitable to publish in a student journal. I'm not involved in this anymore. I've passed the baton on to someone else, but I'd highly encourage you to do it. It's really good at getting sort of honing your research skills and writing skills. And also, if you don't have any publications and maybe you want a collaborative authorship, you can get involved in this collaborative that we're running, and you can find out more information about all of these on the links or by sending emails. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Matt. Up next, we have not one, but 2 speakers who will talk about academic careers beyond AFP. First, we have a former AFP and a current ST7 in neurology, Dr. William Sedley. Welcome, Will.
Well, thanks for the invitation to speak and for your attention. My name's Will Sedley. So I'm a neurology trainee, nearly finished training, and have had the privilege to be on the academic track, starting with the AFP for some years now. So I can't tell you everything about careers that might lie beyond AFP, but often the most useful thing is really just to hear from the experience of someone who's kind of been there and taken some next steps. So hopefully you'll find these useful in some way. So just a very brief summary of what we're going to cover. I'd like to start with really a step back and actually why we're doing any of this and even considering doing AFPs, and then my experiences in terms of where I stood, what my interests and experience were before the AFP, what I did on the AFP, the next steps I've taken, and with a little luck, what the future may hold for me. So I think what it really boils down to is, why are we doing this? it's to be in the privileged position to be paid to indulge in what should eventually be our main hobby in life, which is to conduct enjoyable and innovative experiments, meaning we enjoy the process and enjoy doing it, and it's new, it's never been tackled before, and it serves an important purpose. And I think if you can tick all those boxes, then why would you want for anything else as a sort of main activity in life, really? So it's worth bearing that in mind, because I think if there's too much deviation from it feeling like this for too long, bearing in mind there'll always be moments that things don't feel so good, then you've got to question things. So before the AFP, I think I've known for some time I was interested in the brain, and I mean the workings of the brain and the mind. In medical school, I would read Oliver Sacks and Ramachandran. I foolishly subscribed to the Journal of Consciousness Studies, which had some great articles. I rarely got around to even reading them, but it looked good on the shelf. Liked things like meditation, was interested in the idea of psychedelic substances and how they could alter one's experience of reality with such a simple chemical effect. Phenomena like phantom limb pain and how our experiences are so different to necessarily what the physical world is sometimes, and things like mirror therapy that can be used to attempt to treat these. And I really didn't know whether I wanted to be a neurologist or a neurosurgeon or specialize in non-invasive brain stimulation, even a psychiatrist or a radiologist, but something neuro, and lots of ideas, very little concrete path. In terms of actual sort of concrete experience to back this up and bolster the CV, not a lot really. I had my medical degree experience so far. I've done a research project in microbiology and nothing geared towards these interests. I liked the idea of research. I don't think I really knew what it was all about. Saw the AFP advertised. I was studying in Nottingham and thought, that looks quite good. Why not apply? So just to look at a bit of a map of the UK, I'd grown up in Cambridge and sort of thought about returning closer to home. Saw this post in Newcastle. Thought, well, it's kind of a step towards Cambridge. So I thought, could I live in the north? I've never really been. Well, maybe I've been once. Seemed quite nice. Yes, I can. Applied and was lucky enough to get the post. So that was great, and there were a lot of ideas and possibilities, and not really a clear sense of where to begin. So I think the purpose of the AFP is that it's an initial step. It's a kind of foot in the door. You don't have to do an AFP, but it helps get you started. Finding a research area, a supervisor, just getting some experience of the research method and techniques under your belt, and pilot data, the all-important pilot data to furnish your future applications. So the academic neurologists at the time were Professor Turnbull, or Professor Sir Douglas Turnbull now, Professor David Byrne, Professor Patrick Chinnery, and Professor Tim Griffiths. So I spoke to all these individuals, and they're very different research areas, from mitochondria, movement disorders, genetics, and then auditory brain functioning. And I think that the latter was geared most to my interest, so I approached Tim Griffiths, who was kind enough to take me on, really. So moving up to Newcastle, there were all these grand visions about all the sort of historic quayside, all the redevelopments and all these lovely views you see when you cross into Newcastle for the first time. And I think the reality was even better when I turned up at my hospital accommodation, as you see here. So when I first joined, I turned up in Tim's lab, and he was like, "Well, great, good to have you here. What should you actually do?" And I think he went out on a bit of a limb for me, and he'd struck up this collaboration with Matthew Howard in Iowa, who's a neurosurgeon doing invasive brain recordings in neurosurgical patients. Just struck up a very important collaboration. I thought, well, why not send Will there to kind of help cement this? And I think his exact words by email were, "He is bright, motivated, and largely socially appropriate." Now, where the largely came from, I really don't know. I thought I'd been on my best behavior, but he obviously saw through that, what I was really like anyway. And the response was, "Great, send him over." They put me up here, which I think certainly at the time, make of it what you will now, this was the lap of luxury. That was my hotel room for 6 weeks. And we got some nice data and things. It was not very clinically relevant, the research, so maybe not the best long-term prospects for a clinical academic. And Tim said after that project was done, well, what about working on tinnitus? Ringing in the ears, isn't it? I thought. So my initial thoughts were, that sounds really quite dull. I'm interested in lots of sort of much more juicy phenomena, complex hallucinations and things like that. There's not really a local research expertise in tinnitus, 1 or 2 studies, doesn't really overlap with clinical neurology. So naturally I said, great, yes, let's go for it. And just I hadn't realized actually how common tinnitus is. And you'll see on this simple pie chart here, actually, that to truly have no tinnitus at all puts you in the minority. And then there's this very large category in black who hear some ringing in their ears if they're in a soundproof room, no other sound source, and listening to what they can hear, they do hear a very faint tinnitus. And then there's this wedge, sort of 15% of the population who have it persistently audible above background noise, and then a slice, about 2% of the population, which is still a lot of people who have a very impaired quality of life. So it's an important clinical problem. And the other thing is, it's you may think, oh, that this is the auditory pathway from ear to brain. That's quite complicated. When you really get down to it, actually, there's a lot more going on. You've got the cellular level processes and synaptic level processes in the cochlea where the damage may occur. So you kind of need to understand things right down to that fine-grained level. And you need to go to much broader brain networks that actually underlie perception itself and how one reacts to something. What makes the difference between someone who goes, oh, it's a little bit annoying, shrug, I'll get used to this, and someone whose life is ruined by it. I think if you really want to fully understand a condition like this, you're actually traveling the length and breadth of the brain. And I think I quite quickly came to realize that and found the research area fascinating. And even just understanding the system and what it's doing in a simple, ongoing, low-level perception like tinnitus is challenging enough. So my work consisted of, well, you probably won't generally recognize this, but this is the Hexham Saltburn train, and I was staying in Middlesbrough at the time, commuting up to Newcastle. I spent a lot of time on this 2-carriage train, and it's very associated in my mind with tinnitus for a number of reasons. Firstly, it squeaks and squeals like anything because it's very old and it sounds like tinnitus. And secondly, I realized that in my long hours sat on this train, I could cause a little bit of tinnitus in myself by doing forced jaw contractions, clenching or forward protrusion by activating the pterygoid muscles here. I do not recommend you do this because initially this would elicit a tinnitus-like sound at the time. What I came to find is I've done this so much over the weeks and months that the tinnitus became permanent and has never gone away since. So as I say, I really don't recommend this. Never bothered me, but ideally would probably not be there. So I did a research study that I came up with using this jaw movement phenomenon to make people's tinnitus louder. And you can examine them in a state where it's louder, where they're making the jaw movement, and where it's quieter. Contrast those, did some EEG recordings, and it all looked very promising at first. But eventually it turned out what we were seeing was just a product of the muscle activity and not underlying brain activity, which can be very hard to distinguish, and the controls just weren't pushing as hard. So unfortunately, that study and everything I'd sort of invested in for the second half of AFP really didn't come to a lot. So by the end of the AFP, I was left thinking, well, I've got really good colleagues who I enjoy working with. I found an enjoyable and important, interesting research area. I've sort of taken my own angle on it, but it hasn't worked. So where to go from here? And when you all invested in one project and things don't go well, it can get a bit dispiriting. But I thought, no, I enjoy the process and things are bound to work in the end, and thought, well, I should keep at it. I'll try another approach and go until something works. So I applied for an academic clinical fellowship and was lucky enough to get that. And in the ACF, I took further attempts. I repeated the same study with a different recording modality. This is MEG, or magnetoencephalography, which measures magnetic fields. Is much better at separating muscle activity from brain activity, but still the same problem was there. We couldn't be confident it solved it. And had another go using a different way of making tinnitus louder and quieter by using sounds to temporarily modify the tinnitus. And that worked very well. And it actually yielded some very interesting results, which I didn't fully understand at the time. But back at the time, the prevailing theory was you've got these high frequency brain waves called gamma oscillations in the auditory cortex, and really those are what generate the tinnitus and that perception. And if that's the case, then when tinnitus gets louder, they should go up, and when tinnitus gets quieter, they should go down. And what I found is when, sure enough, if tinnitus goes down, these go down as expected. But if you make the tinnitus louder, they also go down, as in you can have a positive correlation here in red and yellow, or a negative correlation, depending on the exact context. And that really shattered the prevailing theory. And the results were quite striking and hard to ignore and reproducible across many individuals. So that kind of extinguished a number of bonfires as my first published foray into the field. And I suppose I didn't make myself many friends at first. But we're all friends now. So that was a good high note. I thought, finally, this is something really important and useful in the field that I've come up with out of my own research direction and ideas, really. And I had a lot of things I was excited to do next. And I thought, oh, well, for a PhD fellowship, I can do this, and I can do some spectroscopy, and I can do some MRI, and I can do some MEG and some EEG. And so Tim Griffith said, okay, look, that's a shopping list of ideas. You're going to struggle to get that funded. Make it hypothesis driven. So while I was out walking the dog one day, it finally clicked, and I put together a plausible hypothesis that linked all the different strands and sort of packaged it and sold it, and was fortunate enough to get funded. And I carried out my shopping list of ideas, and it didn't quite conform to the hypothesis, which is kind of unsurprising because the hypothesis was retrofitted. So it should have been no shock to see that wasn't what turned out to be the case. But I got some nice results of various forms. And then in the last 2 months before I had to submit, and on that note, if anyone who does a PhD as a clinician in future, remember this, and remember this. Write up and submit before you go back to clinical training. No ifs, no buts, even if you've not finished, even if you don't think you've got enough, because it is nigh on impossible and will make your life hell afterwards. And it's so easy to write up when you've got all your time dedicated to it. So I said, last 2 months, I'm going to conduct research. Last 2 months is write-up time. And so I just sat there, read my results, read the literature, and I thought, well, how does this all fit together? And I had some sort of ideas, but I thought, you know what? I knew what I needed. Now, I don't know if any of you have kids, but this is a popular children's book by the author of The Gruffalo called The Scarecrow's Wedding. And in what they want to have, the whole theme of the book is they want to have the best wedding ever, the best wedding yet, the wedding that no one will ever forget. I had a young child and was reading this book a lot to them. I thought, what I need is a figure. I need one figure that puts everything together, the best figure ever, the best figure yet, the figure that no one will ever forget. And so I started with some sketches that were very rough, just putting in everything I'd found and the other key bits from the literature that I believed, and just thought, well, put them in one place, see if they make sense. By about 7 or 8 iterations, I ended up with this. It's not quite the figure that no one will ever forget, it's the figure that no one will ever comprehend. But it did the job, it crystallized the thoughts, and suddenly everything made sense to me. And this culminated in what's been a very influential theory I've come up with to explain tinnitus and all the bits that never made sense before, which has kind of been a springboard into a prominent profile. And so I started out by making enemies and telling people they were all wrong. And then I've gone, actually, everything does work and you're kind of all right, and have made some friends since. In a nutshell, tinnitus, the first bit of tinnitus is a little bit like these random black dots, but in the auditory system. I don't know if any of you have seen this picture, but generally at first you don't think it's anything but abstract or random dots, but eventually if you look hard enough at it, you see what it's about. And if you haven't seen it already, it's a Dalmatian dog, and you see its head here, it's sniffing at something, there's a tree over there. And once you've seen it, once you've recognized a meaningful pattern, you can't unsee it. And tinnitus is basically like seeing a pattern in random brain cell firing in the auditory pathway. And once you've seen that pattern and given it a meaning, you can't unsee it or unlearn it. And then all you have to do is explain things like, well, hearing loss and everything that predisposes you to it is just kind of cranking up the volume and making these dots more and more vivid, and it's easier to see the pattern. But the key second step is whether you see the pattern or not, and that gets lodged, and then you're stuck with it. And the rest was just about actually laying down the brain basis for how this occurs. So after my PhD, I applied for an academic clinical lecturer post, which was quite handily available. It's another post that lets you do kind of 50-50 academic clinical training in blocks, or I actually did days of the week. But it really depends on what your kind of research is. And I thought it was a nice position to generate some hypotheses from this model I'd created and test these. I was lucky enough to get funding for a PhD student who's still working with me now. I tried a few tacks, and one of the approaches does seem to have been successful in testing some of the predictions laid down by the model, which may be of practical benefit in actually diagnosing or measuring tinnitus. And then at the same time, actually, it's amazing how when you're at an early stage in your career, you've just got all the time you want to focus on your research, get stuff done, you can be really efficient. That gets harder and harder because you're asked to review papers, to sit on committees and bodies, to have discussions and collaboration with other researchers, give talks and things. And it's necessary and good and nice in a way, but it's quite an upkeep, and it's astonishing how much of your time you end up giving over to these things. And then again, you get a part of each of these academic posts is to get you the pilot data to get you onto your next step. And by this point, the next step for me will be an intermediate fellowship like MRC or Wellcome Trust. So I've applied for these. Who knows what will happen? They're immensely competitive. But all being well, I would eventually obtain one of these posts. And then it's kind of about the ongoing challenges and match up a research interest in tinnitus with a clinical practice in neurology. There's a lot of overlapping conditions that probably have a very similar basis and mechanism that we do see in neurology, which include pain, migraine, and even fibromyalgia that overlaps across a lot of specialties. So eventually, it'll be a little bit of sort of lateral expansion into these areas, all going well. But we'll see. You have to take it slow and not overreach for fear of doing things badly. So that's about it. That's my experience in a nutshell. Thanks for your attention. I look forward to any questions or discussion we may hold afterwards. Thanks.
Thank you, Will. Next up is Dr. Malcolm Broadley. Malcolm is one of my colleagues and is director of the Northeast NIHR Integrated Academic Training Pathway for Doctors and Dentists. Welcome, Malcolm.
So good morning, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to talk at the conference today. So my name is Malcolm Broadley. I work as a clinical academic in paediatric respiratory medicine in Newcastle. As you can see by the backdrop, it's sometimes sunny in Newcastle, but not that often. And I'm really talking today because one of my roles is director of the Northeast NIHR Integrated Academic Training Programme. And the title of the talk, which I hope will last about 20 minutes, is thinking about the next steps beyond being an academic foundation programme doctor. So what I'm planning to cover is, first of all, probably asking you guys some questions as to why would you want to do academic medicine? Talk about some of the options if that is what you want to do. Perhaps spend more time then specifically talking about the NIHR Integrated Academic Training Pathway, and specifically what's most relevant to people at your stage is the academic clinical fellow stage. So the next step would be to be an ACF. I thought it was important to talk a little bit about steps towards the end of being an ACF around doing a PhD and trying to get external fellowships to fund doing a PhD. And then finally, just briefly, I'll talk about the next steps after that even. So why bother with research or academic medicine is a really important question. hopefully, because you're tuning in to listen to this today on a Saturday, you're actually quite motivated around that question. And I think research or clinical academia or both mean different things to different people. You can probably all recognise the different things mentioned here, everything from papers to presentations to quality improvement audits. But I think what probably drives and hopefully drives most of us is around improving clinical outcomes, so improving outcomes for patients. So why do research? This is a slightly older slide, and it isn't necessarily about identifying new things. It can be about working out how not to treat people, and there's several good examples here. I was preparing this, I thought it really needs updated with the latest, and obviously hydroxychloroquine is a really good example of this around COVID-19. As mentioned, I'm a paediatrician, so here's just some more evidence for you from the paediatric world of the sort of impact that clinical research has had on outcomes for patients. So this graph here is showing the improvement in infant mortality relating to respiratory distress syndrome, basically with the introduction of surfactant. And you can see that that is a dramatic drop that happened with that intervention. And coming back to COVID-19, trying to make it a little bit more relevant to today, clearly these results around dexamethasone from the recovery study are perhaps some of the most widely published and publicised clinical research results of our time, really, but incredibly important at this moment in time. If you think a little bit more broadly as well, there's really quite a substantial body of evidence now showing that hospitals that have an active research culture, departments that enroll patients into studies, actually have improved outcomes. And you can show that not only for patients who've actually specifically taken part in studies, but simply by being treated in a centre and not necessarily being part of a study yourself, those improved outcomes are transferred even to those patients. And this is just one quite well-known example in colorectal cancer. So if we start to think a little bit more personally about why you, and the way I look at it is that most importantly, you can only do research if you're inspired by it, if you're interested in it, if you think the questions that you're trying to answer are important. Because inevitably, it's going to involve a huge amount of hard work, as you've probably found already during your academic foundation posts. And it may be 90% perspiration and 10% inspiration, but you've got to enjoy what you're doing. Otherwise, you're just not going to find the energy to put in those hours, to put in that hard work. So this is a purposefully out-of-date slide. And this was perhaps the idealistic pathway that people who were going to become clinical academics were meant to take. You can see how out of date it is because we obviously no longer have SHOs or SPRs. But this was, in theory, the pathway that you were meant to take. The reality was often very different. And rather than that nice, steady staircase of career progression, it often felt more like a sheer rock face that you were trying to climb. And it is true that there are plenty of different routes that can be taken to reach the same point. Just important that everyone remembers that. What is a really positive thing, undoubtedly, is the NIHR integrated pathway, though. So as I mentioned, that those previous slides were purposefully out of date, and now there is a much more clear and resourced clinical academic training pathway. And I would guess that being a motivated audience, you're probably all fairly well aware of this. So I'm just going to quickly run over it over the next couple of slides. This is a medical audience, but obviously the NIHR is not just about medics. So it's about a multidisciplinary approach to try and increase culture of clinical research in the country. And here you can see a particular mention of the fellowships and pathway relevant to doctors and dentists. This is it in a bit more detail. You're obviously all at this stage, the academic foundation programme, with the obvious next step in that pathway being academic clinical fellowships or ACFs. So I've taken a few slides, just these are generic NIHR slides, but they're quite important and summarise the background probably far better than I could in my own slides. So each year, NIHR fund about 250 ACF posts and also 100 clinical lecturer posts, which I'll briefly mention at the end. Importantly, from your point of view, they are administered and appointed to on a regional basis via a grouping of medical schools, so-called deaneries or higher education groupings, medical education groupings, and also linked NHS trusts as well, the so-called IAT partnerships. The actual posts themselves, I wouldn't worry too much about this, but the way that they are allocated on a national basis to each region can either be via a formula or a competition system. So effectively there's a bidding process that goes on. So not every region may not have exactly the same number of posts or even the same specialty of posts available. And this is partly worked out by a competitive bidding process, and then there are other metrics involved like NIHR funding that each region may have attracted, etc. As mentioned on the final bullet point there are also key priority research themes, and some posts can be linked to a theme. And these are the current priority areas as identified by NIHR. And I guess the idea behind this is to try and encourage young academics to move into these particular areas of need. And these will obviously change with time. So I think you're all probably listening to this to hear about ACF posts. So the short summary is that they last for 3 years. They give an academic split of 25%. So that means that 75% of the time is spent doing clinical training, but a quarter of the time is spent in academic-based work. And this can vary in different regions. And there's probably less flexibility than there is around clinical lecturer posts, but there can be some flexibility exactly what's done and how it's done. Importantly, they're obviously specialty specific in terms of the clinical specialty, and they're applied to and allocated on that basis. And the usual or expected outcome is to, at the end of an ACF, then attract funding for, ideally from an external fellowship, to then undertake a PhD or MD. So quite a lot of the time during an ACF post may be about trying to improve your CV to make yourself competitive for these sort of applications, to generate pilot data for these fellowship applications, and hopefully also generate publications, but all working up towards this target really. It is possible to apply for an ACF post if you happen to have already done a PhD, and I can think of several people in my region that have done that. And obviously, as mentioned about the different paths, you don't absolutely have to go on to do a PhD. And I think I'm correct in saying that a run through clinical training post still follows with an individual if they choose to do that rather than undertake a PhD. Really importantly, they're normally advertised in October each year. There was quite a bit of uncertainty this year around COVID and what was going to happen, but my understanding is they will be advertised potentially next week on the 1st of October nationally. So if you're interested in at that stage, you need to be looking out for adverts in the next couple of weeks. This is just to show you that NIHR have a lot of information on their website. This page gives you details of the program leads for each region. So this is me here. And that also reminds me to say the next couple of slides I've taken from my colleague John Sayer, and they talk a little bit specifically about the ACF program in the Northeast, but are relevant to most other programs as well. So just by way of illustration of the sort of broad range of specialty posts that are available, all of these have been available in recent years in the Northeast, and it's similar in most regions. You can see mention of themes here as well. And in all regions, there's some form of teaching attached to being an ACF as well. So for example, in the Northeast, there's a program that leads to the award of a postgraduate certificate in clinical research. And this is regarded as something that has to be done. And it teaches generic skills about research, governance and ethics, study design and data interpretation, communication and education in research. And this is done via a day release system and some online learning as well. What does research time give you? What does an ACF post give? So crucially, it's time to think, time to read, time to write, away from a clinical area, away from having your bleep or DEX phone going, to try and develop those ideas, as I mentioned. It can give you time to visit local research groups, even external research groups. Each post comes with a bursary that can be used for travel to conferences, but it could just be collaborative visits. And it lets you obtain pilot data and build up your CV. And I think crucial to these posts are the academic supervisors as well. Clearly this is someone who's separate from your clinical supervisor, but really important that you have an appropriate supervisor or group of supervisors to provide that mentorship, that guidance, and to help you at this stage of training. And I think it's having someone that you can work with is obviously crucial. And part of their job is to develop with each trainee an academic training program and realistic set of goals and targets. So I've put in a few slides next from other talks that I've done about external PhD fellowships, because as mentioned, that's really one of the key sort of targets at the end of an ACF and what you should be working towards. They also crop up again later on with so-called intermediate fellowships, but we're going to talk about PhD fellowships today. So a number of funding bodies offer these sort of fellowships. Some of these websites are a little bit out of date, as you can see, but there obviously are MRC, Wellcome, this is NIHR, who have their own fellowships, and I have a slide coming up on that, and Wellcome as well. Wellcome have changed their model, and often these are now administered on a regional basis. And importantly, a fair few charities and offer disease-specific fellowships as well. There's a lot of advantages to having an external clinical fellowship to fund a PhD. The amount of money offered tends to be enough to fund the work correctly. They're seen as prestigious things to have, can bring allied opportunities, other training opportunities, networking opportunities, etc. And as a trainee, it arguably gives you a certain amount of independence because it's your fellowship. There are some downsides in that these awards can be competitive. So putting in that hard work to develop an application is just absolutely required. And you could argue they're dependent on track record and CV, as we've talked about. They may often involve an interview and can be a lengthy process. Some work's been done. I think these were holders of an MRC training fellowship, and work's been done to show by having one of these, most people actually go on to an academic career and or hold senior clinical positions. So the outcomes are actually fantastic for people who have training fellowships. I mentioned that NIHR have fellowships as well, and this slide is only in here just to point out to you that some aspects of their scheme have changed recently, but certainly there are doctoral fellowships available, and full details on the website. So to develop a fellowship application, I think you need all of these aspects. You clearly need the inspiration, you need that idea. It's helpful if that idea plays into a narrative around the disease that you're interested in. It can be a story about you and your career as well, because after all, this is about training. It's helpful to have supportive preliminary data and support in the broadest sense in terms of supervisors, institutional support as well. I think it takes time to prepare these things. There are different aspects to the application process and different audiences at the different stages that you need to win over. So first of all, you've got to be eligible to be able to apply. Applications tend to be reviewed then by external peer reviewers. So these will logically be experts in that particular area. So they need to be impressed by the project and think that it makes sense and is deliverable. And then often there's actually an interview stage as well for people that are shortlisted. And that is a much more general panel of experts. So you've got to be able to sell the project to that kind of audience and be able to answer their questions. The mantra being that the person, project and place are all being assessed. In the next few slides, I'll just talk briefly about each of those aspects. So as mentioned, the project is obviously very important, and that first stage of review, I think, is often about the project. Traditionally, these sort of applications will be hypothesis-driven projects that have to be both novel but deliverable as well for a PhD. Helpful if you have preliminary data, and it's certainly crucial to have a logical experimental plan that isn't all predicated on just one experiment. The person, because this is obviously something that you need to be thinking about now. So I'm sure you're all enthusiastic people because you're choosing to listen to this. But working on that CV in terms of publications, presentations, relevant experience, all really important. Having supportive references that clearly show that those people know you as an individual, I think, can only help as well. And try and articulate where that fellowship will take you. You need a supportive and appropriate team that have that track record, that have the time, though, to be able to put the time into you as well. And clearly the wider environment and training environment are very important as well. So what happens after you've successfully completed your PhD? So obviously now, at this stage, and the next obvious step is a clinical lecturer post. So these posts, in brief, last for 4 years, often through to CCT. And they truly give a 50-50 split between academic work and clinical training, leading up to commonly for applications for intermediate fellowships. And CL posts give genuine flexibility about how that time is spent. So just to summarize, hopefully, what I've gone through, perhaps really and most importantly, choose to do what you enjoy. Inevitably, it's going to be hard work and you have to persevere with it. I would strongly recommend a career as a clinical academic, though, because I think that the pros outweigh the cons. So the advantages being that independence, that it can be enjoyable, stimulating and flexible. Inevitably, it's hard work, and there is a balance there with clinical work, with family life, for example, but it's possible to achieve that balance. I should acknowledge, as I mentioned, John Sayer and NIHR for some of those slides. I think there's a chance to ask questions as part of the panel. Also would be happy for anyone to contact me, especially if you may be interested in applying for ACF posts in the Northeast. Thank you for listening.
Many thanks to you both. Now we have our panel discussion. If you'd like to ask our panelists anything, please drop your questions into the hashtag AFP in our virtual coffee room channel. Good morning, Malcolm. It's good to see you on a Saturday morning.
Yeah, good morning. I've been enjoying listening to the talks.
It's been a really interesting session. I have to say I've learned lots myself about the programme from Paul, and it's been really fascinating to hear about the experience of our trainees. So a great session so far. Now, broadly, Malcolm, what we wanted to do today was think about how students might go about the process of applying to the Academic Foundation programme, how students, new F1s, might get the best from the programme, and then, of course, how they may progress further in the academic career pathways if they choose to. And there's been a lot of questions in the Slack room around the application process and some of those specific questions. But actually, one of the things I was thinking about, the first question that a student needs to make is, needs to ask themselves, is research for me? And I was going to ask you how you decided research was for you, and particularly how you came about to be in paediatric respiratory related research. Tell us a little bit about some of your choices there.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, so I think I first became interested in research really when I was a medical student, which is obviously a bit of a time ago now. But I was able to do quite clinically based projects when I was a student that I actually really enjoyed. And I think it was about perhaps having that time to really get involved in something in more detail, which I think is still can be an issue as an undergraduate in terms of what research lets you do is really truly get involved in something and perhaps get to know the people that you're working with that a little bit better than you do during a lot of usual attachments. And I found that I just actually enjoyed the process of really getting involved in the detail of something. What there didn't used to be was the integrated academic training pathway, which I think is genuinely a fantastic thing.
Yeah.
Because what someone like me did was kind of undertake projects during their clinical training. I did a variety of different projects to kind of bolster my CV, if you like. What's always been crucial, I think it still is crucial, is kind of seeing projects through and making sure that the outputs from them are realised. For example, presentations and publications. And I was able to build up my CV and then actually take 3 years out of programme to do a PhD. And it was at that time that I really became, I guess, heavily involved in paediatric respiratory research and realised that I could combine the research with my clinical interests. And marrying those two together, I think, is just an amazing privilege that clinical academics get to be able to do. And so you can have that motivation and that interest in a disease because you deal with people who have it, and then explore those ideas in your research as well, hopefully by trying to improve outcomes for patients ultimately. And that's the kind of pathway that I followed. And after doing a PhD, I then became a clinical lecturer because by that time the integrated academic pathway had been invented, and I was able to become a clinical lecturer and then at a consultant level continue being an academic basically.
Yeah, so I think you made a couple of interesting points that I can resonate with as well. One of which being taking having some research opportunity or additional experience during medical school, and I similarly had an undergraduate course at Cambridge where in my third year I had a full year of a particular subject and had a dedicated project during that time. And I really enjoyed the opportunity to get to grips with a particular area and explore particular research questions and be part of that small research team. Do you think, I think one of the things with the Academic Foundation programme is that many students might be a little anxious that they haven't got past research experience whenever they're thinking about applying for AFP. Do you think that's a problem? Do you think that's a barrier to applications?
Yeah, I don't think it should be an absolute barrier at all. Obviously, I think by definition, most academic programs tend to be reasonably competitive. So it's certainly true that planning early and trying to work on your CV is always a sensible thing to be doing.
Yeah.
But I personally don't think there should be absolute barriers, because I think at an early stage of career, what's more important than anything, I think, is enthusiasm to undertake research, enthusiasm and hard work, essentially. But it's certainly wise, people listening who are perhaps early on during their student careers as a medical student, to be thinking ahead and trying to sort of take the most of any opportunities that may be available, to undertake projects and thereby try and improve their academic CV, if you like.
I think that's really sound advice, actually, Malcolm. Really sound advice. I mean, something that struck me from your career path and Will's path is that you seem to have quite a clear idea right from the outset as to the type of research, the type of clinical area you'd like to work in. I guess my own experience is perhaps I took on a PhD because I was keen to do something different, and it was serendipity that allowed me to pursue a PhD in pediatric immunology. There was a post available, and I applied for it, but it was perhaps less directed as yours. But once I started that research program, it hooked me, and I've wanted to stay in research ever since. But I think there is a point about for trainees and students starting out in the academic career pathway, they don't have to know what specialty they want to be in, do they, really?
No, absolutely. I think what's probably crucial and having mentors who can, and supervisors who can provide advice. I think that is so important.
Yeah, no.
Stage, really, because those are and having the right sort of mentors who can genuinely encourage and provide the kind of right and appropriate advice is important. But I think limiting yourself at a very early stage to a very specific area within a subspecialty, for example, for research it's actually probably unrealistic, actually. And people should go with their own ideas and what they enjoy and what interests them, is what I would say.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, actually. So I think we've talked about sort of why students might consider research. If you've got a curiosity about asking questions, if you want to try something different, this might be the program for you. This specialty is something that can evolve over time. Trainees will learn some generic academic skills during the course of their AFP. So those are really important basic questions to consider. I mentioned at the start that a lot of the comments we've had and questions in Slack chat have been around the application process, and many of the academic units of application have white space questions. And I was going to draw on your thoughts as to how applicants might make the most of those white space questions. How can they sell themselves best, do you think?
Yeah, no, so that's a really good question. And I think it takes time actually to write these sort of applications. I think we all find them challenging. I guess perhaps a good piece of advice is to try and put yourself in the seat of the person who's going to be reading potentially several hundred applications.
Yeah.
It's always sound advice to make it as easy as possible for the reader. So it has to come across clearly, whatever point you're trying to make. I think naturally most of us enjoy hearing kind of human stories and examples. So in effect, by personalizing what's spoken about, immediately interests most people, actually. So trying to weave in genuine, authentic examples of perhaps projects that you've been involved with can only make it come to life, really.
Yeah.
These sort of applications, especially where they're relatively open questions, I think they just can't be rushed the night before the deadline. It's another important piece of advice. Yeah. And they just need to be really carefully written.
Yeah.
But there's something about getting the general points across, but then having specific examples that will make it easier to score the points when someone's perhaps having to read a lot of applications and to score them fairly.
Yeah, I think that's very fair, and I suppose we do have to acknowledge it's quite a competitive process. Yeah. So your point about prior thinking, planning, and drafting of the white space questions are well made. Being clear, having examples. The other things to add would be about showing that you have had past experience, or you can reflect on what opportunities you've had and how to share those experiences on your application, and demonstrate commitment. So what area of what discipline, what area, what academic thinking you've made ahead of applying to the academic foundation program. If you can make contact with a supervisor, so that you're already thinking about potential project areas, maybe not specific, but project areas, can certainly let the reader know that you are a committed individual who is very keen to have the opportunity.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and by having made that contact and thought about projects, and I don't think we're talking about huge amounts of detail, but having thought about projects, it's actually much easier to write and fill those sort of white space questions anyway.
Yeah, no, totally. The other part of the application, of course, is the interview, and trainees are interviewed for the AFP. The same question, what sort of tips might you have to perform best at interview?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think it's tough, isn't it, for anyone? I think there's a certain knack to staying calm.
Mm.
So
to have to say.
Staying calm and just thinking about the question that you've just been asked.
Yeah.
I think what helps with that is practicing. I think that's sound advice. So just trying to do as many practice or mock interviews as possible can only help on the actual day.
Yeah.
Having sat on a few different panels, I think what tends to kind of annoy people who are posing the questions is if someone clearly doesn't answer the question that they've just been asked, and I know we see politicians do this all the time on TV, and it probably annoys viewers. So it's about trying to think about the question that you've been asked and then calmly answer it. And again, a bit like the white space questions, if you can actually then weave in some specific examples based on your application form or your experience, I think that only impresses panels, really.
Yeah.
And it can often be fairly obvious if someone's enthusiastic and knowledgeable. Within the first couple of minutes of them entering an interview, there can be quite radical differences between individuals, and part of that is just through having prepared.
Yeah, I would totally agree, and I would just echo your comment about the trainee or the student who is enthusiastic, that they're coming to the panel really wanting to be there and demonstrating an enthusiasm for the application, for the post, where in some of their white space questions they might have demonstrated commitment. They're coming to an interview similarly reflecting on their interests, but that enthusiasm I think is really important. The other point that Alex made in the Slack chat, which we should probably just flag as well, is that the interview is likely to include clinical questions as well as academic type questions. So applicants should be aware of that, and I think Alex has pointed folk to the Oxford Handbook of Clinical Medicine just to brush up on some of the acute scenarios as well. So it is a combination in AFP of clinical questions as well as academic type questions.
And certainly in ACF interviews, which I have more experience of, often people will be given some sort of paper to read and potentially kind of present a piece of data and talk about it. which people are given on the day. And obviously you can only prepare to a certain extent about that, but just doing your own research and to know that you may be asked to do that kind of thing, rather than being, incredibly shocked on the day when you're handed something to read 15 minutes ahead of your interview, just to try and do the background research before the day can only be a sensible thing to be doing.
So there is a common thing of preparation, really, isn't there? Absolutely. One of the questions in our Slack chat was around where to apply for an academic foundation program, whether one should stay close to the home medical school or whether one should think about applying elsewhere for a completely new opportunity. Do you have any feeling yourself as to which might be a preferred option?
I think you just have to do what feels right. Actually, I don't think there are right or wrong answers to that question. I can think of I've supervised an academic foundation doctor who moved to the region for the program, and I think they found it quite refreshing actually to come to a different centre. I think there are some differences between the individual programs as well in terms of how the academic time is sort of dished out and how it's worked out over the 2 years. So I think reading about that, and if you have strong feelings about the way you'd like the time to be sort of split, that may influence where people may wish to apply. But no, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer about where.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think Paul made the same point about looking at the individual programs as a huge variety in the differing types of programs and the offer. Some are more structured, some are less structured. So making that decision in the context of what the particular foundation school and how they present their AFP program is really important. I should just mention that we're having a really nice chat about some of the key themes around the AFP programme. But if folk wish to pose further questions in the Slack chat, it will be open. Please do use Twitter. Please contact FDocs, and we'll be happy to pick up those questions after the event, of course. Matt gave a really nice reflection on both highs and lows of the programme. And as I said at the beginning, I'm so impressed with some of the stories that our presenters have shared and their own experiences today. But I think there were a couple of important points to pick up around some of the lows and the challenges of the programme, in that it is more self-directed than the clinical posts. It can be lonely at times, and you can have quite short periods to achieve a meaningful research activity. Those are important points, aren't they? Any thoughts on those?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think inevitably academic medicine and research involves hard work, and there are always going to be some low points as well. I think personally that in actual fact any trainee should never actually be feeling particularly alone. I know we all do at points, but in any program, there really should be a system whereby an individual is not just left to it. I think it's crucial. It probably comes back to the relationship with supervisors and program directors, but I think any responsible supervisor should not be expecting someone who is inevitably at an early stage of their career to just get on with it, if you like. I think that the days of that being acceptable have actually passed a long time ago. So I would like to think that people should always feel supported. And obviously research groups vary a lot in terms of the work that they do and how they operate. But what a lot of people find is actually this one of the strengths is sort of joining a group of like-minded individuals doing similar work. And there can be genuine camaraderie there, the way there is amongst junior doctors in clinical posts. But I guess probably a common theme to doing academic work is being motivated and having that degree of self-motivation. And I think that is kind of inevitable. But people who apply for academic foundation programs tend to be a self-selecting group in that you have to be fairly motivated to be applying. So I would sincerely hope that the highs outweigh the lows considerably. And each program really should have and will have a structure in place to support people if they're genuinely feeling isolated.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Malcolm. And actually, my own experience of working in academia is these are small teams, small groups where you get to know your supervisor and other members of the team really well. So there's considerable support available to trainees. The other point that I think Matt made was around managing expectations, and a practical point our piece of advice I would give would be about managing one's own expectations and making sure that whatever piece of work you set out to do is focused and achievable within the time frame. And again, that discussion with your supervisor will hopefully make sure that that is the case. Well, thanks ever so much for joining us. Really, really enjoyed your presentation. And Malcolm and I have been picking up just some of the key themes about why to go into research, what type of specialty, and some of the issues around process and how best to sell yourself. From your own experience, have you got any thoughts yourself as to whenever you reflect back on your applications for ACF and ACL, because that's a question that trainees and students have posted on the Slack chat as to how to maximise their presentation. How did you sell yourself in your ACF and ACL application? What tips might you have for some of the people listening today?
It's a good question. So I think in terms of selling yourself, it's hard, because I think I after I got my post, I was speaking to some of the panel members later in a social setting and saying, out of interest, why did you pick me? And it was a very vague answer I was given. And I think what I took from it is, I don't think they have a checklist of criteria. I think they want someone who has something unique about them, or something that makes them stand out, or a sense that they've got a passion for it. I don't know. I think maybe the ability, demonstrating the ability to show a sustained interest and to take your own direction. And I think I don't think there's specific things to tick, but maybe just find out what it is that you've done in your history and in your career so far, however small, bearing in mind this is all, at the stage you're applying, you won't have done very much probably, but just try and identify what are the things that reflect you or make you stand out from other people, or demonstrate some sort of drive over and above just following the normal path, really. The other thing that really helped, and in terms of sort of picking AFPs, ACFs, projects and everything, is the very clear tip is find a good supervisor, a good person to work with. It does need to be an area that captures your interest, but you may not know whether it captures your interest for some time after working in it. But you need a good supervisor, because you need so much more than a good project. You need career advice, you need support for the next steps if it goes well, for alternatives, and someone who cares and takes an interest if it doesn't go well, someone who you get on with, who will help you express and develop your own ideas. So I think if you're thinking of applying, speak to the people, identify a short list of the people you might work with, meet them, talk to them. Don't be presumptuous, but talk about what you might do, how it might look if you got the post. And I think if you can see yourself fitting into that, and you feel passionately, I'd love to do this, that will come across at the interview and in your application.
I think those are really good points, and resonate with the conversation that Malcolm and I had a while ago. I think you've also flagged a point that both Alex and Matt made in their talks about non-academic activities and how important they are in terms of adding to you as an individual when you come to an interview, to demonstrate some of those professional skills and some of that self-directedness that you're referring to, that make you stand out from the crowd. And of course, Alex very nicely described what how variable and how diverse his activities were during his AFP program, which is another nice selling point coming to an interview. So it's the project, but there's much more than just your project whenever you're coming to an interview. It's the individual, it's the other activities, that enthusiasm, the different activities that you've done, as well as some of those attitudes that you referred to as well. And of course, you make a really valid point about that every medical career is never straightforward, and that there will be kind of stones and obstacles along the way, and having that supervisory support right from the outset is really important. Yeah, absolutely. One of the points, as we maybe just round off today's discussion, Paul made right at the start, was that you don't necessarily need to do AFP to progress along an academic career pathway. So maybe just start with Malcolm again as to, in terms of for those that can see themselves pursuing a career in academic medicine in the next 5 years or more. So do you have any thoughts on that at all?
Yeah, no, I think that's true. In that you can apply for an ACF post having not done an academic foundation program. So that is a really important message, isn't it? Inevitably, as we've spoken about, most ACF posts are relatively competitive. So it is so important to have tried to optimize your CV, to have kind of completed projects that you may have been involved with, trying to be associated with the outputs from projects, etc., which then just makes it so much easier to write that application and I guess to score points on the application as well. But yeah, you don't need to have been an academic foundation doctor to have taken part in projects, to have perhaps done some presentations, perhaps generated some to be an author on some publications. That can absolutely still be done, and people can start trying to do that as a medical undergraduate, certainly, and as a foundation doctor who's perhaps undertaking more clinical based research during their clinical posts as an F1 or F2.
Yeah, perfect. And Will, maybe one of the final comments should go to you, really, as a previous AFP trainee. If you could do it again, would you still do academic foundation program?
Oh, no hesitation at all. I absolutely would do it. And I completely reiterate the point. You don't need to do an AFP to get on an academic career. But I think if you're thinking of an academic career, you'd be mad not to apply. I don't think there's a good reason not to. You don't need to technically to do an ACF either, but the reality is you need something before you apply for a PhD training fellowship. You need pilot data experience, because you need to show in the application to the interview that you have generated this research idea, it's thoroughly thought through and it's workable, and you've demonstrated your potential to do it. So there's no way you can do that without some experience. So AFP or ACF can be enough, the two together, better but not essential. But as you say, you can cobble together, you can get or amass research experience as an undergrad. You might even squeeze a bit in on the side in the clinical program. I think it gets very hard, but it's doable. But yeah, I'd apply, and you'd absolutely apply. And for me, it was the beginning. That's what set everything into motion. So it's very difficult to imagine what my position would look like now had I not done it, really.
Yeah. No, fantastic. So I think so. Essentially, a great program, lots of opportunities. Students need to make contact with foundation schools, think about which program suits them best. Make contact with the supervisor, because that individual is pivotal for the planning and their support for their academic placements, and give it your best shot. Yeah. So, as I mentioned before, do email us via the FDocs email address. Do use Twitter, do use the Slack chat room, and we can continue the conversation afterwards. But I think for now, my thanks to all of the speakers today. It's been great to hear your own reflections and your advice on the programme. And thank you everyone for joining us today elsewhere. Many thanks.